Hi, my name is Chris Orwig, and welcome to the short course on making creative color adjustments in Lightroom. In this course, we'll look at topics like how can we create vivid and vibrant colors, or how can we fine-tune color, or maybe do things like change the color of a studio background, or enhance hair color. We'll look at some techniques which allow us to remove color or improve a sunset or a landscape photograph. We'll explore how to use the split toning controls to create a cool or a warm toned image. And we'll explore how we can use the HSL controls to fine tune colors. We'll also explore how we can use presets to speed up and expand our color workflow. Then in the final chapter, we'll go through some projects from start to finish. We'll be covering all of these topics and much more. So thanks for joining me. Let's begin. Welcome to the challenge for this chapter. Sometimes the challenges in my courses will be difficult, and other times they'll be a little bit more about play, practice, and fun. Well, that's exactly what this challenge is about. It's about taking what we've learned and having some fun applying it to an image. Here's how the challenge works. For this challenge, I've provided 3 different images, this one, or the next, or the following. And what I want you to do is to select just one image. You don't need to work on all 3. And see if you can't apply some of the techniques that we've covered in this chapter to one of these images in order to make it have more beautiful, vivid, and vibrant colors. For this challenge, I'll give yourself about 3 or 4 minutes. And then if you're interested, come back to the next movie, which is a solution movie. And there I'll show you my approach to creating more beautiful colors in these photographs. All right, well, good luck in this challenge. Have some fun with this one, and I'll see you in the next movie. Hey, welcome back from your challenge. I hope that went well. I hope it wasn't frustrating at all, but just some fun, because that's really the point here, is to have some fun with some of these basic controls to bring out some vibrant and vivid color. All right, well, for the solution movie, let me walk through these 3 images. This first one is a photograph of an abandoned farmhouse in Tuscany. The color temperature looks good, so I will skip that. Although sometimes if I'm not sure if it's good, I will drag the slider around a little bit. When I drag this around, I can see the blue overpowers things. Yellow is too yellow, so I'll just leave it as is. I may come back to that, but probably not. Next, go to my exposure controls, brighten it up a little bit, add some contrast. This one's almost textbook, right? I'm just going to walk through these controls. Highlights drop down, shadows come up, whites leave there. Blacks, darken those up just a little bit. And then down below for my clarity, I want some clarity, some texture. Then I'm going to need some vibrance and some saturation. And after having added all of those things together, or mix that together with my tone and presence, I tap backslash. Here's before. Let's zoom in so we can really see that, and then tap it again and see the after. Then next, I would go back to my temperature and use the arrow keys, tap it down to decrease the temperature. That actually looks kind of good. Just a little bit less, cool it off so the yellows aren't quite so overpowering. Brings out a little more blue in that area. And with this image, you really don't need to tinker with it that much more. I think with that, it's pretty good. I love it. I love the colors there. It's kind of fun and vivid. Here's our before and after. Okay, let's move to the next image. With this one, this was a morning shot of Florence. And in this case, we have these cooler tones because it's early in the morning, so I may want to bring those out more, but I'll start off by leaving them where they are. Exposure, it feels like the overall image could use a little bit of brightening. Contrast is going to really help. It's going to help those blues to come out even more. Shadows probably won't do a lot. It can just bring out some of the shadow detail there, but don't need a ton of that. And then deepen and darken some of the deepest blacks a little bit there. Clarity is going to be huge for this image. Because it's captured in the morning, it's a longer exposure, it's a little bit soft, so clarity will help make that one snap. It also loses some of the color, so vibrance to the rescue, right? Whenever clarity goes up, vibrance tends to tag along and go up with it, and maybe a touch of saturation there too. And once I have the saturation up, I'll go to my temperature slider and drag that around a little bit, see if there are any fine-tuning there. I think it's pretty good. Now for the highlights, that'll be the brightest tones. What we can do is dial in a look for those. You can see we have all of those lights there. I can have them sort of blown out or a little bit more detail there. I actually like them kind of bright and misty almost. Yet when you make an adjustment like that, you always want to double check. Tap the J key. That will show you if you have any clipping. And here it's showing me, yeah, all the brightest spots I have some issues. To fix that, of course, we could bring this down, or if we want to have it have the real bright look, just go to the tone curve and then click and drag that white point down a little bit, and we still have the same color that we had before, as we've talked about in a previous movie. All right, well, with this one, I'll tap the backslash key. Here's before, a little bit dull and lifeless. Here's after, loving it, right? It has those bright, vivid colors, warm and cool tones, all in one frame, and I like the way it looks now. All right, next we'll go to one last photograph. This is a picture of an old rusty door. And with this one, I want to bring out hidden colors, vibrance, saturation, bring those up, add some contrast. The exposure and everything else, it's probably okay. There's not a lot to do with some of these other sliders. My temperature slider, no adjustments here. I don't want to lose one of the colors. In this case, this image is all about cool and warm tones together, kind of like the previous one was, right? So when you have color which is pretty good, you don't necessarily need to even use these controls to create a more interesting color palette. How far we go with all of this will really depend upon the vision for the photograph and what we're looking to create. But let's say we want to have sort of a surreal color palette that we could use in some fun way. Here we have it. Tap the backslash key. There's before. Press it again. Here's the after. And with all three of these examples, I hope that what you're seeing is that all of this stuff isn't really rocket science. It's just about using our controls here and using the skills we picked up in this chapter. One last thing I just noticed is I have some clipping here in the deepest, darkest shadows. To fix that, go to the tone curve on this one and then bring that value up. It's always a good idea to double check that. You can press the J key to toggle that clipping indicator on and off. And in this case, you can see we were able to create really nice, vivid color. We also were able to recover highlights in one image, shadows in another. And that is a wrap for this movie. As you'll soon discover, in each and every chapter of this course, I've included a challenge. The challenges are designed to give you a chance to put into practice some of the topics that we've covered in that chapter. In order to get the most out of the course, be sure to take some time to do those challenges because they give you a chance to experiment and play and to tinker with different ideas. Then after you finish the challenge, be sure to come back to the solution movies, and there I'll show you my own step-by-step approach to the challenge. If you have access to the exercise files, once you've downloaded those, you can open up that folder. There you'll find all the exercise files, which are full resolution raw files, are organized into different folders based on the different chapters in the course. And here you'll find all the images that we'll be working on in this course. Now, because this is a Lightroom course, what you'll want to do is import those into Lightroom. And then there you can see you can select the chapter that we're working on and then find the image for the task at hand. Now, if you don't have access to the exercise files, no big deal. You can always just follow along. Or, of course, you could try out what we're working on your own images as well. All right, let's begin. In this movie, I want to begin to talk about some of our core color tools that we will encounter in the basic panel inside of the Develop module. Yet before we get to working with our sliders and controls, first I want to minimize the interface because in this course we'll primarily be working in the Develop module. I want to collapse this area above where we can navigate to other modules. Also, we'll collapse the panels on the left by clicking on that triangle icon. Then with the toolbar, if you tap the T key, that allows you to show or hide that. And then you can hover over the dividing line right here and click and drag down to either decrease or increase the size of film strip. The reason why I want to do this is I really want to focus in on the image, in this case, a demo file. We'll start with a couple of demo files and we'll apply what we've learned to an image. But with this file, you can see we have nice bright blues, which become less and less saturated. Now, the reason why I want to start with this file is to begin to highlight that we have some color controls which we may not even be aware of. Now, we tend to think of modifying color here in the basic panel with our white balance controls and maybe vibrance and saturation. But there are some other adjustments that affect color as well. For example, if I drag my exposure slider to the left, can you see how I have more color in the image? If I drag it to the right, now I have less color. It becomes all washed out. So actually, the mix of our adjustments here will affect the color look in the image. Drag the contrast slider to the right, and as you probably know, that increases color saturation. Drag it to the left, and it decreases it. Now, what about the brighter tones? Well, we could bring our highlights and our whites down, recovering detail there, but also recovering color, right? Our shadows will affect that area, changing the color look. As well, the blacks. Here I can darken that up, and you can see I have a much different image, much different color palette, much different saturation than before. So one of the reasons why I want to highlight this is just to illustrate this idea that the way that we modify these sliders does affect the color. So typically we'll want to go through those, and then maybe we'll add some other adjustments, say like vibrance and saturation. Now, often these two are confused, so I want to clarify how they work. Now, I like to think of vibrance as a control which is friendly or which favors the weaker colors. It searches for a hidden color and it tries to bring it out. Watch as I drag this to the right. Can you see how it's bringing out color, which I didn't even really know was there? And so it's helping those weaker colors more than it's helping the colors which have more color saturation in them. If we drag this to the left, well, it's going to remove the color in the weaker colors first and leave some color up there in the stronger colors. Now, saturation, on the other hand, is linear. And what I mean by that is if you drag to the left, no color, drag to the right, more color. But take a look at how when I drag to the right, it added more color, but it didn't really help out the weaker colors so much, whereas vibrance comes to save the day with those tones down in this area. Okay, well, let's add another layer on top of that. To do that, we'll move to another photograph, another file. This is an image of some artist chalk. And let's talk about our white balance controls. As we know, drag to the left, it cools things off. Drag to the right, it warms them up. We can also double-click any of these sliders to reset. And then we can affect the tint, right? And here you can see I'm changing all of the colors. And these sliders tend to sort of overpower whatever color was there. Double-click those sliders to bring them back to their default settings. Next, let's go through our tonal adjustments. Here, if we set the exposure, that really sets how much color we have. Contrast, we can increase or decrease the color saturation with that contrast slider. If we want to bring more color and details from these brighter areas, well, we could drop the whites down and the highlights. So I'm bringing both those sliders down. Now I have more color in that area than before. And you can see how I'm bringing more detail into that area. The blacks, as we've seen, make deeper, richer colors. In the shadows, sometimes we need to bring some back there. So that's bringing some light back into those shadowy areas. Okay, well, so far so good. We have created or crafted a unique color look using these sliders: contrast, exposure, highlight, shadows, whites. You get the idea. Now, what about using some of our presence controls? Well, one slider we haven't talked about is clarity. What clarity does is add mid-tone contrast. And let me zoom in on the image so you can see that a little bit better. Here's without clarity, and here's with clarity. It adds really nice kind of texture and tone, but sometimes can also make the image look a little bit, I don't know, maybe dirty or dingy. And here you can see why that is what's happening is it's actually removing color. So when you increase the clarity slider, it actually drops the color down a little bit. So often if you have increased clarity, what you need to do is bring up a little bit of vibrance and maybe even a little bit of saturation. Now when I have a mix of clarity, vibrance, and saturation, we have a pretty good look in the image. Tap the backslash key, you can see here's before. Tap it again and you can see the after. Another thing I want to highlight, which I'll do by moving to another image, is that with our vibrance, as I mentioned before, what it really likes to do is to find these hidden colors. So with this image, you can see I have some artist chalk. It's all gray except for one blue piece of chalk. And here perhaps we increase our exposure or set our contrast and our blacks. Maybe we add a little bit of clarity and decide, hey, I want to increase the color saturation. So I drag this to the right. Well, in doing that, sure, the blue's a little bit bluer. We see some little orange specks here, but the gray chalk is still basically gray. But take a look at what happens as I increase my vibrance. Well, when I increase that, it found all of this hidden blue. All those colors were there, but now when we increase that vibrance, it brings or draws those out. Okay, so how can we apply what we've learned in order to create really vivid and vibrant colors, which aren't really necessarily photorealistic, but are beautiful? Well, let's look at how we can do that with this photograph. This is a picture of this chalk drawing that is huge. It's probably, 10 or 12 feet wide by 6 or 7 feet tall. With this image, we'll start here in the basic panel. We can use our temperature slider and we could cool the image off or warm it up. The trick with this slider when you're looking to create interesting color is to think about how less can be more. If we overdo this, the image just becomes kind of yellow, not very good, or it becomes too cool. Double click the slider to bring it back to the default setting there or the way it was captured. Often you can just nudge this a little bit. Say we want to cool this off, we just nudge it to the left. Now the tint slider, that's probably the one that you will skip most frequently. In other words, you're not going to really use the tint slider very much when it comes to color. It's a little bit more for correcting color problems than it is for adding or creating interesting color. Next, we'll go through our adjustments here, increase the exposure a little bit. We'll crank up that contrast, right? That's going to add that nice color saturation, much more vivid and beautiful colors there. Highlights, we can drop those down, bring a little more detail in some of the brighter areas. Shadows, just bring up a little bit more in those shadows just to brighten them up. And then the whites, that's our brightest white point. Just leave it probably right where it is or bring it down a touch. And then with the blacks, I'll drag this down. That's going to increase the density of the image. And let me exaggerate for a moment. As we darken the blacks, can you see how the image obviously overall has become dark? So if I'm going to do that, I may also want to go back to my exposure slider and bring that up a little bit. So often with these sliders, you're going to go back and forth between a few to make the changes. Next, we have clarity. With an image like this, let's just zoom in on the photograph so we can really see it. Clarity is going to be, it will be awesome because it will add all this nice texture and mid-tone contrast, except we lose the color we once had, so I need to bring my vibrance up. Now, because I already have such vivid colors, and vibrance, as we've talked about, it just brings out hidden colors that we didn't know were there. Like if you look at, I don't know, maybe her shirt here, it looks white, but when I bring up vibrance, we see blues and purples and some greens. Or in the field, we see so much more color there as well. So bring that up to bring out some of those hidden or weaker colors. And then what I was going to say is with an image like this, which has such vivid and beautiful colors, we won't need to do much with saturation because if I bring this up, the color will block up. Like we lose texture and detail and it's just overdone. So maybe you'll bring it up a touch, but not very much. Then at some point you want to press the backslash key. That shows you the before. This was the original file, which we thought looked good, but now here's the after. Now, all of a sudden, that is a lot better. The way that we were able to accomplish that with this type of image was to go through all of our adjustments, modify them, mix them together, using all these sliders, and being aware of how each slider affects color. And then even fine-tuning it after the fact. After we've brought in our vibrance and saturation, you can see I'm going back and just trying to find just the right value. When it comes to moving a slider incrementally, dragging this slider here, it's a little bit too slippery or it moves too quickly. So what you can do is just position your cursor over it and then use the arrow keys. Down arrow key decreases it, up arrow key increases it by a really small increment. And so that can be a nice way. So you go to a slider, hover over it, and then tap the up or down arrow key to make any needed changes. I think right about there looks pretty good. And then, as I mentioned before, tap the backslash key to look at your before and then tap it again to see the after. So how can we take what we've learned about exposure, color, and tone and apply that to improving the colors in our photographs so that they aren't super vivid and vibrant like the previous example, but a bit more photorealistic? Well, here we'll do that, and we'll look at 3 different images and 3 examples, starting off with this one here. This is a photograph which is a reflection of a building that I captured recently when I was in Florence, Italy. And the image feels a little bit flat, a little bit dull. I want to bring out some more color. So I'll jump straight to the basic panel to do that and begin by increasing the exposure, or sometimes by simply clicking on the auto button. The auto button will give us an auto adjustment to these sliders and controls. Sometimes it will be close. I may just need to modify them a little bit. And here it looks like it might be nice to modify them in this way. Bring a little more detail in my shadows, brought my exposure down a touch, and just made some subtle adjustments. It was a good starting point, and then I made some further changes there. Next, I think the blacks are okay, and I'll go down to my clarity slider. If we click on the image, we can see it's this really fun reflection that we have here. Clarity is going to help bring out some more details there, so I definitely want to add some clarity, which means if clarity goes up, typically you'll need to bring vibrance up a little bit, and I'll bring some saturation up as well. Now, if we zoom out and see the whole image, with all of this, we have a pretty fun color palette. but it looks like the yellows are, I don't know, they're almost too strong for me. So one way to change that is to go back to the temperature slider, hover over that, and then that will activate the field. And then if you tap the down button, you can then decrease the temperature in some subtle ways, or tap the up arrow key to increase it. And sometimes what you can do is just say, hey, you know what? I'm just going to bring a little bit of that yellow down. And I think that's nice right about there. So with this one, it was simply a matter of working with auto tone and then fine tuning those controls, adding some clarity, vibrance, and saturation, and then modifying the temperature slider a little bit. If I press the backslash key, you can see this is the before and then this is the after. Let's move to another example, another image. This again is another raw file, photograph of some family friends down at the local beach in my town. With this one, it was captured at sunset. And what I found with sunset photographs where the sun is illuminating the subjects is that rather than going warm, sometimes it's kind of fun to go cool. So I'll click and drag this to the left to cool this off. We'll bring out some more of the blue of the reflections. Then we'll go down to our controls, add a little contrast there, decrease my highlights, boost those shadows. As I'm making all these adjustments, I'm keeping an eye on color, right? Thinking about how it's affecting the color. Blacks are dropping down. Add a little clarity, just adds that nice pop or snap to things. And then a touch of vibrance will bring out some of those other colors there in the image. Saturation, I'm going to probably leave it right as is. If I add too much saturation, what will happen is it will just look like the skin tones in particular will look a little bit overdone. So I want to be careful that I'm not going too far with that. And with this image here, if I press the backslash key, you can see this is before and then here's after. So we're fine tuning the color, creating this really fun and interesting color palette in the photograph. Again, here's that before and then after, so you can see that. With these kind of adjustments, using the temperature slider, obviously it's subjective. If it's too blue, and it might have been too blue, I could bring that up a little bit, or we could, of course, warm that up even more. But I think things become a little bit lost because there's too much warmth in that image. So in this case, I liked it a little bit more with the cooler tones. All right, so somewhere around there, and then I'm going to drop my saturation down a little bit too. With this next example, let's take a look at how we can not only improve the color, but also fix the clipping, which can sometimes happen in our shadows or our highlights without negatively affecting the color in the photograph. Well, here we have a picture of a mom and daughter, and these are two of the family members from the previous photograph that we just worked on. And with this image, you can see that the sun is behind the two subjects here. So what I want to do is I want to open up or bring in some more light on the subjects. To do that, we can go to our basic panel and just bring up the shadows. Now, when we bring up the shadows, we're definitely bringing in more light there, but it's a little bit too washed out. So if we zoom in on that area, you can see how as I bring that up, it just becomes a little bit too washed out. So I'll add a little more contrast back into the play, which helps out with the color. Now, the idea for the mood for this photo for me is to have it really just sort of bright and ethereal. It's this wonderful mom-daughter moment on the beach. So I want to bring up my exposure here as well. Now, all of this is already improving our color, right? So if I press the backslash key, you can see here's before and then here's after. There's just a better mood and color palette in the image than there was before. Next, if we want to fine tune the temperature, we could go to the slider and maybe drag it just a little bit to the right. But again, we want to be careful with this slider. If we go too far, we overpower and the image just looks sort of yellowed. So double click that to reset it, maybe just nudge it a little bit. And talking about nudging color around, when you already have beautiful color, you won't need to do a lot with your presence sliders. Here, maybe add just a touch of clarity. Again, not too much. If we go too much, it will look almost like it's an HDR image, which I don't want to have. I want to have this kind of nice, soft, bright look. So just a little bit of clarity, just a little bit of vibrance. It was saturation, none at all. Because take a look at what will happen. If I bring my saturation slider up, we have these hideous yellows here. If you already have bright, vivid, wonderful color, you won't need to do a lot down here. Or if anything, maybe just a little touch of it will help out. But here I think that's probably enough right there. Now, if we zoom out for a second, we can then press the backslash key to see the before and after. And let me zoom in as well so you can see that up close. You can see how we have beautiful colors, this nice bright look to the image. Yet sometimes when you get to this point in your workflow, you may realize, you know what, I also need to make sure that I have good detail in my shadows and in my highlights. Speaking of shadows, I want to darken those up, or the darkest tones there. I'm going to just bring my black slider down a little bit. And in order to check for that for any type of clipping, you can go to the histogram. And in the histogram, you can either click on these little triangle icons, and that will turn on what's called a clipping indicator, or you can also access that by pressing the J key once. It will toggle those on and off as you press that. So here I'll press it once to turn it on and another time to turn it off. Now, what exactly are these indicators? Well, these are telling me that I have some issues in the image. The red is telling me I have some problem in the brightest areas of the photograph. If I had blues, that would show me I had problems in the darkest areas. And let me just create a problem for myself by decreasing the black slider here. Can you see how we have those blues down in this area? So I have these problem issues. Now, with these issues, sometimes you can use your sliders to try to correct for them. But in other situations, you'll find, like let's say with this one, we try to bring our highlights down, or we try to bring it down with our whites, and we just can't fix that issue, or it's kind of tweaking the color in a negative way. If we want to maintain the same color look, here is the expert tip for doing that. Rather than using your sliders, we will go to the tone curve panel. Inside of the tone curve panel, you want to have the clipping indicator turn on so you can see the problem area. If you have an issue with the darker points, like the blacks down here, like we have, we'll go to the black point in the tone curve and just nudge it up just a little bit. See how that issue is now gone. If we have a problem up here in these brighter areas, we'll go to the white point and we'll click and drag that down just a little bit. It's the smallest adjustment. But what that did for me, and we could also bring it down more if you wanted to recover more, but often it's just a little touch of what you need to do. And what that will do is it will allow you to have really beautiful colors, nice bright tones or dark tones without any issues of clipping where you're losing detail in your shadows or your highlights. And most importantly, what I found in my own workflow is that this technique right here will help me to recover detail in those areas without affecting the color in a negative way. With that final note, that is a wrap with this image. Let's zoom in on this one so we can see it here. And then I'll press the backslash key. There is the before, and then press it again. Here is the after. Another one of our essential and core color tools inside of the basic panel is the white balance tool. And here I want to take a look at how we can use the white balance tool sometimes to get started and to integrate it into a creative workflow, and other times how we can use it to shed some light on how we might modify the color and tone. We'll start off with this photograph here and work on a couple others. With this image, if we want to use the white balance tool, we can press the W key or just click on the white balance tool icon, which is located right here. Now, this is another one of these photographs of a chalk drawing, and this one is probably, again, 6 or 7 feet wide by, 8, 9, 10 feet tall. It's this huge piece here, and I was there, so I know that the chalk that was used here was white on the shoulder, so I'll click on that. And when we click on that, we click on an area which we think should be neutral, it will remove a color cast for us. And often, this is how we'll use the white balance tool. What I want us to start thinking about is how we can use this as a starting point or as a way to give us insight into how we might modify color. Like here, we'll use it as a starting point and say, hey, you know what? Well, why don't I add some contrast? Now, with this type of an image, I know I want to have really vivid and vibrant colors. So I go to Vibrance. I also go to Saturation, maybe deepen my blacks, bring up my shadows. I'm not necessarily going for something which is photorealistic, but which has all of this wide gamut of colors. If we tap the backslash key, you can see here's before, and then tap it again, here's the after. And it was all about removing the cast with white balance and then going through our workflow here to bring out those colors. Well, let's look at another example. This is a photograph which is a sparkler, which I captured in my backyard in front of a chalkboard. Now, I was there, and I know that the chalkboard was a neutral color, so we can grab the white balance tool and click on that. And when I click on this, what it does is it removes the cooler tones from the image, but it just makes the image too yellow. And so sometimes you can use the white balance tool as an indicator to say, hey, you know what? Rather than going over here yellow, I want to do the exact opposite. So go to this pull down menu, go back to as shot, and then say, hey, well, what if I cooled this off and I brought this over here? And then I went through my workflow of increasing contrast, deepening the blacks, adding some clarity and vibrance, and maybe a little bit of saturation. And after having done that, we could fine tune, of course, how far we went with that color. But you can see how what this does for us, here's the before and then the after. And let me zoom out too so you can see that one as well. You can see it helps to have this really nice color combo where we have these blues in the background and then all these beautiful warm tones there with the sparks that are flying off of the sparkler. And in this case, I think that makes for a more interesting photograph. All right, well, let's move to a picture of a person. This is a photograph which was an editorial project. It was an assignment that I had. This is the raw image as it appeared straight out of the camera. I just cropped it as a square because the publication was going to print it as a square. And next, what I need to do, or what we need to do, is to work on the color. So sometimes we can reach for the white balance tool and we can click on something which we know should be neutral, her pants here, and that will remove the color cast from the image. But here it's making us realize that, well, the color cast was part of the reason why the photograph looked so good. I mean, it was shot at sunset, so I shouldn't have correct color. But it did also help me realize that having some blue in there might be kind of fun. So I'll go back to this pull down menu, go to as shot, and basically this is where it was compared to that custom color. So what if I just dial in a little bit of my own temperature adjustment and maybe a little bit of my own tint there, and I'm just going to modify that a touch. And here we now have this cooler color palette, which is kind of cool. Now, next, no pun intended, we'll increase our contrast and exposure, bring the highlights down, recover some of those, bring my shadows up, and then bring just a little bit of clarity in there. Now, when we have color which is this intense, and it looks like it was maybe a little bit too intense, we really won't need to do much with vibrance and saturation. We've talked about that before. If we look at the color palette that we have, if we increase the vibrance, it's just going to overdo everything. Same thing with saturation. It's going to become sort of blocked up and strange. If anything, sometimes when you have really vivid colors, you may just drop down your vibrance or drop down your saturation. Sometimes that can help make the image have a more realistic or natural look to it. Like here with this one, it does look like it was sunset. We have these different colors. Tap the backslash key, there's before. Tap it again, and here's the after. And for a project like this, the insight came from the white balance tool. I mean, it gave us the idea, right? But then we said, hey, you know what? Forget what it did for me. I want to customize my own adjustments here. And then we integrated that into the rest of our workflow using our tone and presence sliders. When it comes to creating good and creative color in your photographs, as we've seen, we can use the white balance tool. Yet it's helpful to keep in mind that this tool has good intentions, but sometimes it's a little bit over ambitious. So sometimes we'll need to fine tune the results. And here we'll look at 3 examples of how we can do that. We'll start off with this image here. This is a photograph of my brother-in-law and his family. And if we zoom in on the picture a little bit, you can see there's this slight weird color cast. One of the things that we know is that my brother-in-law, Jeff, here is wearing a tuxedo. That should be neutral. So before we go to the white balance tool, though, I want to modify my exposure and tone, and here's why. Take a look at what happens to his shirt if I decrease the highlights. Can you see how there's even more blue in that area? And just to exaggerate for a moment, I'll increase the saturation. We can see there is some color in that area. So before we use the white balance tool, often we'll want to get our exposure correct. One way we can do that, as we've seen, is to use the auto option, and then we can customize this further. Perhaps we want to make a few little modifications to the way that this appears, perhaps something like that. Also want to bring in a little bit of clarity there too. Then I'll go and use the white balance tool. Now with this tool, I can see there's some blue on his jacket, also on his shirt. And so now that I have those tones where I want them to be, then I'll use the white balance tool and click to sample that area. Here, it color corrected the issue. There's no longer a blue color cast in his shirt or jacket or anywhere else in the image for that matter, but it's just overdone. It's overambitious, right? We can see there's this huge yellow shift. If we go back to the as shot option, you can see the difference there. There was the original image out of the camera with auto white balance turned on the camera. And then here's after we tried to correct it in Lightroom. So it's just a bit overdone. So what I'll do is fine tune that by dropping my temperature back to where it was. Or another trick is you can double click on the slider icon. It will take it back to the default setting. And if you do that, you can then figure out, okay, well, that's how far away it was. Maybe I just want a little bit of that or 25% of that adjustment or something along those lines. Now, in regards to vibrance and saturation with an image like this, we really don't want to modify that at all. If we were to increase the vibrance, colors would become sort of fake and surreal. Same thing with saturation. We don't need it. And sometimes when you have nice colors in the image, leave those two controls alone. Okay, well, here's the before and after view. Tap the backslash key to do that. Backslash before and then again after. So with this example, it's all about fine-tuning the results from the white balance tool. But it's also about starting with our tonal adjustments and then moving to white balance. Let's look at another example. This is a photograph captured for a friend who has a granola company. And here we have all the granola in these different bowls. And you can see if you look at the image, there's a little bit of a blue cast in here. This was captured in open shade. And so shade has a cooler color temperature. So to correct that, we'll go and use our auto adjustment to auto modify the tone and dial in at what type of contrast we want, maybe a little bit of clarity, then use the white balance tool. And I know the spoon should be neutral. We can see the colors in that little grid, which is showing us where we're clicking. We could go around and look at other areas and just see where we're getting a little bit of this blue color cast. And then we can click on that part of the image. That removes the blue color cast, but again, as we've seen, just like before, it went too far, right? At least for the type of look I want to create. So I'm looking at the difference between these two values. Went from 4,900 all the way up to a temperature of 7,800. Well, let me just fine tune that and bring that down a little bit. And that will bring back some of that other color there, but I'm okay with that. I think that has a nicer look to it. And if we zoom in on an area of the image like this area, the granola looks kind of delicious, doesn't it? Well, here we zoom in and tap the backslash key. You can see this is before, and then now here's the after. We have that yellow, maybe a little bit more warmth there, but it's not quite so overpowering or overdone. It looks like a natural color palette. Okay, well, last but not least, let's look at a portrait of the person who created this granola here. And with this portrait, we'll again go through the option of dialing in our settings. You don't always have to use auto. I actually find in my workflow, it's sort of 50-50. Sometimes auto works, sometimes it doesn't. So if you're new to Lightroom, though, it can be a great way to start things off. But we do want to get our exposure and whatnot in a pretty good place for how we want the image to appear. Then we go to the white balance tool, hover over the image, and just look to see if you have any color shifts in there. I'm seeing some color shift in the shirt, so I click on that. That's making the white shirt, but then the image has gone too far, right? So again, looking at that before and after, it went from 5,400 all the way to 13.5 and also modified the tint there. So I'll go ahead and fine tune that. Double click that one just to bring it back. I'm going to scale this way back. Only need a little bit of that. Maybe brighten it up a little bit there too. And if we zoom in on the image so you can see the color that we have, here's the before, then I'll press the backslash key again to see the after.